Still Separate, Still Unequal. America's Education Apartheid by Jonathan Kozol.
In our presentation today, we'll be focusing on the separation between racial and ethnic groups that still poses a threat within the education system, including the contributing factors to this and issues with the separation and diversity amongst education. We'll also be talking about the resegregation and causes of negative and social and economic results, such as the limited livelihood resources that are provided, including the distinction between provided services in different schools, the financial inequality between racial groups, specifically looking into a university tuition study, and teacher salary inconsistency. And finally, at the end of this presentation, we'll be talking about the solutions to the resegregation, such as the Skinnerian approach and new rewards and sanctions.
America's Education Apartheid. Apartheid is a system of institutionalized racial segregation which existed in South Africa from 1948 until the early 1990s. In this article, Kozol speaks about an aspect of the American school system as education apartheid, which refers mainly to inner-city schools that are less than 1% white, with the majority of their students being Black and Hispanic. Kozol also examines the racial resegregation in American schools 50 years after the Brown versus Board of Education case, and highlights the effects of this resegregation primarily on low-income and minority students. The picture on the right depicts a segregated school in Topeka, Kansas, the heartland of the Brown versus Board of Education case.
Brown vs. Board of Education. Brown vs. Board of Education is a famous 1954 U.S. Supreme Court case. The court found it unconstitutional for schools to deny a student salary on the basis of race and ultimately ruled race segregation within public education a federal crime. The picture on the left frame from left to right, George Hayes, Thurgood Marshall, and James Navid, the lawyers who fought in court celebrating the Supreme Court ruling of segregation to be unconstitutional.
Still separate. There's a common misconception that racial segregation has significantly diminished in the decades following Brown versus Board of Education and is now a thing of the past. However, the general trend shows rapid racial resegregation after decades of temporary progress following the Supreme Court case. Statistics show that cases of racial isolation have trended upwards from the 1990s onward and sees the majority of minority students populating city schools with the majority of white students populating suburban schools. For example, Baltimore Sun reports 40% of Maryland's statewide student population to be white. But in Baltimore City, its largest city, only 7.6% of the student body is white, and 90.1% to be either Black or Hispanic. This is just a visual representation which shows a percentage of each region's Black students in schools with a student body that is more than 90% minority. In simpler terms, it just shows the trends in racial isolation from 1968 to 2011. Factors contributing to educational resegregation. Following the Brown versus Board of Education case, efforts led by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. were made to integrate students of different races in schools in prime locations. However, schools like these and many others became more racially isolated after decades of temporary change. In the article, Kozol says, schools like these are not found only in deeply segregated inner-city neighborhoods, but in racially mixed areas where the integration of a public school would seem most natural. He also says that it takes a conscious effort on the part of parents or school officials in these districts to avoid the integration option that is often right at their front door. Factors contributing to educational resegregation. Reluctant parents. Despite the outlaw of segregation in schools in 1954, there was still an ideology of Black inferiority. Many white families were reluctant to have their children enrolled in integrated schools. White flight. White flight is white movement from the city to the suburbs during the post-World War II era and onwards. Still unequal, America's apartheid schooling. There is a relationship between the racial composition of a school and the resources afforded to them. White flight caused a situation where schools in the city, which tend to cater more to a Black and Hispanic student population, receive disproportionately less funding than predominantly white schools in suburban districts. For example, the Pacific Standard magazine reports that non-white school districts receive $23 billion less in funding than white school districts. The article also explains that on average, nationwide, high-poverty white districts receive approximately $1,500 more per student than high-poverty non-white districts.
In Jonathan Kozol's article, he mentions the 1896 Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. The infamous trial ultimately ruled in the decision of separate but equal being acceptable and tolerable rationale or set of reasoning in the American society. The court's decision of allowing racial segregation to be considered constitutional set the foundation for the authenticity of segregation within the education system. The phrase separate but equal was used in the equalization of schools, distinguishing two different educational facilities, one furnishing Black students while the other furnished white students.
Segregated school system, a tale of two schools. In this video, two students, one from a white suburb high school and the other from a city school, speaks about the different resources available to them. In the interest of time, we will only watch a section now, but the video is linked and can be accessed at a later date.
To provide for those school supplies for students, but they don't, and the teachers have to come out of their paychecks just to be able to support their students.
That's our observatory. It's a giant dome with a telescope, and you can see the entire sky from there. If every school in the country can be like McLean, I think it's really going to increase standard of living, just going to make things a lot better.
Obviously, it's not fair. We have not even half of what they have. We're all students. Why shouldn't we receive the things that they have? We're all trying to learn. We all want to grow up to be something, so why shouldn't we receive the same advantages they have? I don't understand that.
Unequal opportunity. There are differences in resources and funding afforded to predominantly white versus non-white schools. For example, clean things, gardens, mold or building issues, classroom sizes, libraries, music art programs, and physicians. By 1993, the number of doctors had been cut, a cutback that affected most severely children in cities' poorest neighborhoods, where medical was most needed. Major arbiters of culture blame this dichotomy on things such as shifting economic factors and serious budget crises to avoid addressing the fact that race has a major role to play in the distribution of resources to different schools. Students of deeply racially isolated neighborhoods and schools feel hidden, that America has no room for them. They don't feel as if anyone cares what happens to them. Social inequality. There is no misery index for the children of apartheid education. Non-white students do not enjoy school the same as their white counterparts. Utilitarian recitational methods are employed in more schools which cater to low-income and minority students, a practice virtually never seen in majority white schools. Rather than a learning to understand approach, focus is placed on high test scores rather than ensuring that the content is grasped and enjoyed throughout the learning process.
Financial inequality. Low-income and minority children are locked out of opportunity for preschool education, while children of the privileged who can afford it are given rich developmental early education. This creates an unleveled playing field when students enter the public school systems, with more white children being provided with more early childhood education than their corresponding non-white children. These non-white children already start at a disadvantage. This starts showing in the high-stakes test, which all students must take, but not all students were taught the basics.
Financial inequality continued. No Child Left Behind. Bill signed into law by President Bush in 2002. Since the enactment of this bill, the number of standardized exams children must take more than doubled. The achievement gap narrowed in the 3 decades following the Brown versus Board of Education case, when segregation steadily decreased. It then widened most in the 1990s, when federal courts began dismantling the mandates of the Brown decision, and has generally stayed unchanged since then. With majority non-white schools tending to receive significantly less resources and funding, and with focus based on high test scores, instead of truly understanding concepts, many students of this population tend to get worse grades over time as their foundation was not sturdy and the environment was not conducive to learning.
In 2019, the results of a conducted study comparing the relationship between university students' racial composition and their increasing tuition rates were published. When examining data from different types of universities around the U.S., two main questions were examined. These were, what are the effects of tuition increases on racial diversity at public institutions over time, and do the relationships between tuition increases and the racial diversity at a four-year institution vary by institution selectivity? At the end of the study, scientists found that there was a significant negative relation found between the increasing rate of college tuition and the university's racial composition of their student body. To add, the study conducted also found that the rate of increase was dependent upon a 2- or 4-year university, along with if the student was a first-time freshman or an upperclassman. A study was conducted researching the specifics of the side effects of tuition deregulation. The difference approach for reaching out to the low-income college student demographic came out with mixed results. For example, regarding a 4-year traditional institution in Texas, their use of tuition deregulation allowed Hispanic students to be negatively affected, while Black students and other racial groups were torn between a positive and negative feedback. The issue with tuition deregulation is that the institutional autonomy of tuition setting does not provide aid to diminish socioeconomic diversity within university campuses, mainly due to the reason that financial aid access for low-income students hinder the abilities that deregulation can provide.
Is money the best solution? Solutions so far include new incentive systems, curriculum to government standards suited for the special needs and learning styles of low-income minority students, with an emphasis placed on raising test scores and uniformity of time management among teachers. Secondly, school reform, which targets poor children of color. If you do exactly what I say or show, you will succeed in school and life. And thirdly, the scenario approach, as a way of altering attitudes and learning styles. It is used in penal institutions, drug rehab programs. It decapitates a child's capability for critical reflection, and it contributed significantly to the achievement gap between Black and white children. If non-white schools were given the same level of funding and resources, these issues would significantly decrease, as evidence clearly shows that students who have been afforded the adequate resources and funding have performed significantly better.